Good evening, everyone. We'll just give a couple of moments for everyone else to join us, and we'll start in a couple of minutes. We'll give the others a minute more and we'll get started. Okay. I'd like to acknowledge First Nations peoples of the lands where I live and work. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging as traditional owners and custodians of this land. Today, I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Camaragal people, while many of us on the panel and in the audience are coming together from the confines of our homes from the many nations of Australia. I also pay my respect to the First Nations people of those nations. My name is Niru Palanivel, and I'm a human rights lawyer. I'm also the former campaign coordinator for Chill Out, and I'm a longtime member of the End Child Detention Coalition. The current political and social climate is an important time for intersectional work to promote and advance social justice. In our session today, we're going to talk about one such issue: children in immigration detention. The End Child Detention Coalition is made up of 26 member organisations from across Australia, and this includes over 150 staff members, around 1,200 volunteers, and approximately 220,000 supporters across all states and territories. Collectively, these organisations possess a wealth of experience in policy and advocacy, and together we advocate for the release of children from immigration detention. The State of Play webinar series features members and supporters of the End Child Detention Coalition, and they share their knowledge and expertise and their read of the current context via these series of targeted discussions, and they're usually held online via webinar series. Just a note today that today's webinar will be recorded and made available online through our social media platforms. If you have any questions, please pop them in the chat box or QA function below, and there will be some time for QA towards the end. So this webinar today will provide some data-informed evidence from Sandy Jackson about the most effective forms of advocacy to create legal and social change for children in immigration detention. We will also hear from Sophie Brazenor, a Year 9 student who spent a year researching and producing a podcast to raise awareness of the Tamil family containing Priya, Nades, Kopika and Tharunicaa. Najeeba is unable to join us today, everyone, and sends her apologies. So Sandy is our first speaker today, and Sandy Jackson recently completed her PhD from the University of Sydney. Her research examines how the Australian refugee advocacy movement has helped to create legal and social change for children in immigration detention. Sandy has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science, a first-class honours, and a Bachelor of Laws from the University of Alberta, Canada. She is a barrister and solicitor in Canada and a solicitor in England and Wales. She also practiced law for many years in civil litigation and family law before working as an associate to the Honourable Justice Pearl at the Immigration Appellate Authority in London, England. She is currently working as a research associate at the Royal Commission into the Violence, Abuse, Neglect and Exploitation of People with Disability. Hi, Sandy.
Hello.
Yep.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here tonight and share a little bit of my research on children in immigration detention. This is a topic that I'm extremely passionate about, and it's a really important topic. And I hope that tonight my research may be able to provide you with some insights that you can apply to your own activism. So I've got a few slides that I'm going to share with you tonight, so I'll just get those up. The title of my speech tonight, my talk tonight, is The Power of Activism, Creating Legal and Social Change for Children in Immigration Detention. So children in immigration detention is a global crisis. There are over 330,000 children that are being held in immigration detention across the world every year. But despite this, there is this global recognition that children need to be protected. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most ratified human rights treaty. It states that the best interest of the child should always be primary consideration, and that children should only be detained as a measure of last resort and for the shortest amount of time possible. So you might be thinking, well, there's not really any children in immigration detention at the moment. There are no children in immigration detention on Nauru. And recent statistics by the Australian government as of February 2021 state that there are less than 5 children in immigration transit accommodation and alternative places of detention. But we can't ignore the fact that the children from Biloela have been detained on Christmas Island for over 3 years. And there's nothing stopping the Australian government from sending children to detention onshore or offshore in the future if the boats resume and come to Australia. So against this backdrop, I want to share with you what I have learned about the refugee advocacy movement and its efforts in creating legal and social change for children in immigration detention. I hope that my research may give you some insights and some of the strategies used by the refugee advocacy movement in creating meaningful change for children in immigration detention, and hope that you'll be able to learn some lessons and apply some techniques to your own fight. My research began with looking at what the literature says about how social movements can create meaningful reform. Michael McCann is one of the leading socio-legal scholars on legal mobilization. His work provides an understanding of how social movements interact with law to create meaningful change. So according to McCann, law is a starting point for change. Talking about your legal rights, taking cases to court, helps to build the social movement, create public awareness, and mobilize people. But according to McCann, law on its own rarely creates change, but that you need grassroots advocacy, such as demonstrations, protests, lobbying. So he advocates that litigation is most effective when it is combined with grassroots advocacy. Scott Cummings is another socio-legal scholar, but he takes a different perspective. He shifts the focus from litigation and the courts as being the drivers of change to grassroots advocacy. He focuses on the importance of changing attitudes, shifting public culture, and shaping politics before you engage the courts. So although these two approaches differ in how law is used, they are not that different in that both litigation and grassroots advocacy are important. My research involves socio-legal research and interdisciplinary research. So interviews were conducted with 41 people, from refugee activists, lawyers, doctors, journalists, politicians, policy advisors, and 14 interviews with Chill Out. based on my interview data, academic research, case law, legislation, international human rights treaties, submissions to table documents, to table bills and government documents, I developed a novel evidence-based integrated legal mobilization framework. In the integrated legal mobilization framework, litigation and grassroots advocacy work in tandem. So litigation can provide that foundation stone for social movement building, for motivating members, for inciting anger. But grassroots advocacy helps to build sufficient critical mass to influence public and political opinion. Both are needed. So has litigation been an effective strategy for the refugee advocacy movement? Over the years, there have been numerous legal challenges in which the courts have held that people seeking asylum can be held indefinitely, even if detention causes them harm. And the courts have held that children can be held indefinitely in detention, even if it's harmful to them. Children can be sent to offshore detention and returned to offshore detention if they come to Australia for medical treatment. And unaccompanied children have few protections. And even when cases are won, the government often introduces legislation to counter the court's decision or to tighten up its immigration policies. Often they introduce retrospective legislation. All of this leads to harsher laws and policies. So why engage in litigation? Well, my research showed that there were many advantages in using litigation, going to court, even when cases were lost. For instance, it created a lot of anger, outrage, and shock that the Australian government could send children to offshore detention in islands in the middle of nowhere, with inadequate facilities for an indefinite period of time. It was a way to build support and mobilize people to oppose the detention of children. It was also a way to establish a common goal, that is to secure the release of children, and to frame arguments based on the rights of the child, such as the right to health, the right not to be detained. Now, many of you may remember the case M68, in which 267 people, including 37 babies, came to Australia for medical treatment from Nauru. Legal action was brought to prevent their return. But within 2 days of the legal challenge starting, the government introduced legislation to ensure that it could send these people back to Nauru, to ensure that its participation in the detention of people seeking asylum on Nauru was valid. But despite losing in the court, this led to the Let Them Stay campaign and a large grassroots mobilization of activists. There was large support from activists, lawyers, doctors, politicians, and churches. Protests were held across the country, urging the government to let them stay. This attracted a lot of media attention and public support. Over 100 churches agreed to offer sanctuary to these people, and church leaders were willing to be arrested. Some premiers offered to settle these people in their communities. So despite losing the High Court battle, M68 was a platform for a highly successful grassroots campaign, which enabled the 267 people, including the 37 babies, to remain in Australia. So litigation plays an extremely important role in creating change, but equally important is grassroots strategy. So the rallying cry that locking up children is wrong was used by the refugee advocacy movement. It was a powerful way to evoke strong emotions and deliver a focused message. It was a way to highlight the mental and physical harm caused to children in immigration detention and create awareness and change public attitudes. Storytelling was a way to humanize children, highlight their suffering, encourage collective action and empathy. Legal storytelling was a way to demonstrate the impact of harsh laws in a way that people could understand. So stories have greater impact. They're more powerful than legal arguments. The refugee advocacy movement gave agency to children in detention. So empowering children and their families to have a voice, that was a way to influence the public and politicians. And for instance, Chill Out Youth ambassadors, many of them who were in detention as children, they met with senior ministers who were reported to be visibly moved upon hearing their stories about the impact that detention had on their lives. So this is a really powerful way to create awareness and to have an impact. My research showed that there are different times for using quiet, loud, or fearless advocacy. So some activists felt that using quiet, rational, peaceful conversations was effective in influencing politicians because they made them more open, trusting, and engaging. So quiet advocacy was used to get small concessions for children in immigration detention, such as crayons, or pushing for them to attend schools and communities. It was a way for them to make some progress. But other activists felt that it was simply a way for the government to pay lip service to the issue, and that you actually needed loud advocacy to publicize the issue, to create public awareness and put pressure on the government. It was also a way to overcome government inertia when battle lines were drawn. So for instance, the government had plenty of opportunities to release the children from Nauru and bring them to Australia, but they didn't do it until there was all this loud advocacy and this pressure. Fearless advocacy is different as well, and I refer to that as civil disobedience. So many activists, they smuggled in cameras, mobile phones, and food into detention center. Some activists smuggled out the IDs of babies that were held in Villawood Detention Center. And with the help of journalists, they were able to put these pictures of these babies on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald. Now that had a lot of impact. It created a lot of media attention and attracted public sympathy and public support. When activists play to their strengths, it increases their credibility and enables them to gain the trust of public and government. So for instance, when doctors shared their public medical opinion about the harmful impact of detention on children, this is a way to gain public confidence. I mean, doctors hold a high status, they're esteemed in society. So when they use their expert opinion to demonstrate how harmful detention was, people stand out, people notice, and it creates a lot of awareness, both with public and with politicians. My research also showed that there was greater collaboration within the refugee advocacy movement when different groups played to their own strengths and encouraged the strengths of others. There are mixed views on whether it was better to work in or out of the system. So some activists worked within the system, within immigration detention centers, but they often faced a moral dilemma of trying to help these children whilst also working with the perpetrators who are actually causing the harm. Some doctors felt that they could do more within the system, whereas others felt that it was morally wrong to participate in that. There are also mixed views on whether it was better to go for individual or broader reform. So some activists, they were after those individual outcomes for individual children or families. So if you can get that one outcome for that family or for that child, that is significant. But on the other hand, that will not lead to broader reform. And other activists were more interested in that legislative reform, changing public attitudes. Sometimes those individual wins, those individual outcomes can actually lead to broader reforms. What I discovered, or what my research showed, is that you need both. You need those activists who are fighting for those individuals, because these are people's lives and it does make a difference. But you also need to carry on the fight for that broader change, looking to change, making that systemic change in society. My research also showed that the refugee advocacy movement put a lot of effort in trying to influence policy. So making submissions to tabled bills, even though there really was no impact on changing the legislation. So why did they do it? Well, my research shows that it was a way for them to use their firsthand knowledge or experience about what children in detention were experiencing, the harm of some of these harsh laws and policies. It was also a way for them to voice their opinions, hold government accountable, and it provided a historical record. One of the strategies that were identified only in my chill out data was the inclusion of youth. So youth-led advocacy is a way to attract awareness, build relationships, expand networks, and challenge institutions. For example, the Chill Out Youth Ambassadors, they spent a lot of time going to schools, churches, community events, talking about the issue of children in detention, trying to educate people, influencing parents, children. And they had a big impact. They were able to change people's attitudes. It was really powerful to see them advocating for these issues and educating people. They also participated in a lot of demonstrations and protests and met with politicians. And this was a really effective technique, because when you get the youth that are advocating for these social justice issues, people stand up, people notice it, and it has a tremendous impact. So based on my integrated legal mobilization framework, my research has shown that the refugee advocacy movement was most successful in creating meaningful change when they used a combination of both litigation and grassroots advocacy. And an example of this is recently when the children were removed from Nauru. So you had the work of the National Justice Project, who was extremely successful in the courtroom in securing the transfer of critically sick children from Nauru to Australia. But that's not the whole story, because alongside the lawyers, there was also a large grassroots advocacy effort. The doctors, they not only provided evidence in court, but they were extremely vocal about the harm that detention causes children. An open letter was penned to the Prime Minister, and that was signed by 12 major Australian colleges, and over 6,000 doctors signed it, urging the Prime Minister to remove these children from Nauru. Refugee advocacy groups and activists protested, demonstrated, lobbied. A Kids Off petition was collected with over 170,000 signatures. And some politicians were also very vocal. MP Jed Carney, in her maiden speech, condemned this shameful policy of detention. And MPs Julia Banks, Craig Blondie, and Russell Broadbent urged the Prime Minister to remove the children from Nauru. But the most crucial support came from Dr. Karen Phelps, who ran her election campaign on trying to secure the release of children from Nauru to Australia. And once elected, Phelps introduced the Medevac bill, and with support from Labor, Greens, and members of the crossbench Senate, she was able to get this bill passed, although now it's been repealed. But it was this combination of efforts by activists, lawyers, doctors, along with some political and public support, that children were released from immigration detention. In February 2019, the government transferred the remaining children from Nauru to Australia. So in conclusion, what has proved to be the most successful in securing the release of children is when lawyers, activists, doctors, politicians, and the public united to form a critical mass. So the power of law alone, or the power of advocacy alone, is nothing compared to their effectiveness when they are integrated. So where to now? The fight's not over, as evidenced by these children who are still on Christmas Island. The refugee advocacy movement needs to maintain vigilance. There's nothing stopping the Australian government from sending children to detention again in the future. So this victory operates at the moment within a very fragile legal reality. Legislative reform remains the next big challenge. So my final remarks to you are that I hope that tonight that my research has provided you a bit of insight and some lessons that you can take home and strategies that you may be able to implement that will lead to your own success in ensuring that children are not detained in Australia or across the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. That was wonderful. We've just been joined by Najeeba for this evening. Najeeba, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I'd like to apologize for running late into the meeting. So my sincere apology. And for some reason, I'm actually queuing as two people. So once again, I apologize for that as well for showing as two people. First of all, I would like to actually introduce myself. For those of you that doesn't know me, my name is Najeeba Wazefadost. I'm a former refugee from Afghanistan. I've came to Australia like many other refugees by boat. Similar to many other refugee kids, I was actually detained in Australian detention centre down in Curtin for several months before I was actually released into the community. We just heard from Sandy about, the excellent presentation that she was going through and around, some of the issues that refugees experience. For me, I'm really finding this platform quite important to talk about, how those experiences as a young child actually shaped, my growing up in Australia, and how did I have to actually challenge not only the mental trauma that I went through as a child being in detention and then being released on temporary protection visa, but at the same time, how refugees are actually using their resilience and strength to become, to go through those journeys. For me, I came to Australia with a big family, so it was myself, and I was only 10 years old, along with my, sisters and brothers who were also in the range of, 12, 8, 6, and 4, and 5. And in fact, one was only about 10 days old, which was basically born prior we get into the boat and come into Australia. One thing that I kindly do remind when I speak in this kind of platform is that, it is really the desperate situation that actually forced myself and my family to get onto that risky boat and come, into a place where we could feel safety, security, and peace. For us, the overall or the final destination wasn't important. Whether it was Australia or any other country, it wasn't a choice, to be really honest. It was more about, where can we go to establish safety? I remember, as a very young child, when my parents actually put us into the journey of leaving Afghanistan and coming to Pakistan, we were actually thinking that we are going to stay in Pakistan and we're going to apply for, permanency or apply for seeking asylum in Pakistan. But that wasn't the case, because again, we found ourselves at higher risk and seeing that, that there was bigger groups of Taliban coming and going from Pakistan to Afghanistan. That really made us to, think of another alternative place. And I always tell colleagues that, when I was a child back then, having no access to education, not only myself, but the whole family, for us, Australia as a final destination was a very unknown place. We were quite, unknown to the process. We have had no idea back in 2000, what the Australian detention centre could look like. We didn't know that we were going to be detained the only thing that we knew was that, Australia is a country that respects humanity. Australia is a country that respects human rights. And Australia is a country that people are going to welcome refugees. And these were basically the only information that we were being exposed to while we were back trying to come into Australia by boat. And I'm going to share very little about my story because, it's going to take the whole night for you guys to actually sometimes listen through it. But I think it's quite important for me to share some of my reflection from back then and comparing it to today, where we've changed policies. We've moved from one parliament to another parliament. We've moved from one party to another party, and we've gone through the biggest, the biggest crisis of COVID, and how all of these have shaped my life and where I am today, not only as a former refugee, but as an Australian citizen. When we came to Australian Detention Centre, again, it was a horrific experience. It was terrible. It was quite horrifying because, again, as a child, that wasn't the dream that I was expecting myself to be in. And, I never forget that when I actually came into the Australian detention centres and being welcomed by the first Australian security guards, that was a traumatized image that I had to carry with myself for a few years. And again, seeing, guns and security devices and big boots and, uniforms coming towards me, it was again thinking that, it's another form of Taliban in Australia that's coming towards me, just people with blue eyes, people with white color, and they're coming to imprison me, they're coming to separate me from my parents. And it was very horrifying experience. And again, it didn't take us long that, we found ourselves in a huge prison in the middle of desert in Curtin Detention Centre. And what was even more shocking is that as we entered into the Australian Detention Centre, we found a lot of other people, a lot of other children being locked up in those detention centres, in those confined apartments. I think what is very much different from back in 2000 is that, I always tell colleagues and I always try to advocate for one thing, and that is that, not much has changed. People are still detained. Refugees are still getting detained for just seeking asylum. Refugees are still getting detained because they've came by boat for not having any choice. And that was the only way of escaping the dreadful situation from back home. And back in the year of 2000, under John Howard's policy, there were detention centres all around Australia. Children were being imprisoned, and so as myself and my other siblings, we've had no access to medical centre. We've had no access to doctors, no access to education. Not only in detention centre, but also at the time that we were released on temporary protection visa. But if we compare it to now, where we are in 2021, that goes to 21 years, almost 20 years ago. We can see that there has been very, very slow progress in terms of respecting, those human rights, respecting or supporting refugees seeking asylum in Australia. We think sometimes, when we talk about the progress and improvements in Australia, I don't really call community detention, a form of freedom, because you're still detained in the community with limited rights. I work with refugees right now, and I see asylum seekers and we work in our community and other communities and how they're actually being challenged with even the most basic needs. And that goes from food to shelter, from shelter to education, very similar to my time. Back in 2000, my family were not allowed to go, my parents were not allowed to go and read English or go to Navitas or go to any English institutions for almost 5 years under the temporary protection visa, TPVs. And we are actually facing the same restrictions now. So if we are, sometimes we go through the improvements and for me to be very frank, I think it's quite little. It's very, very small. At least back in 2000, we've had much more positive perception and attitude, at least coming from the general and civil society. But I think things are even changing because of the way media has portrayed things. It's not necessary that we have really lack of recognition around, how refugees are actually living very dreadful and terrifying situation from back home, and something that's really making them to escape and leaving them with no choice. Back in 2000, people were getting released in temporary protection visa, and that's happening right now. People are getting released on temporary protection visa, on bridging visa, and people are still living in limbo and uncertainty. Exactly the things that happened to me and my family for almost 4 to 5 years when we were released from detention center. People are not able to study English right now, and it was exactly the same back on those times. People were not able to get visitors, and it's maybe now they can have little bit of visitors, but not as much. So not much has changed, and sometimes I think our parliament, our government in Australia have been playing really with words and terminology when it comes to a way of defending that how things have changed and improved for refugees. The changes have been very, very little. The progress has been very little. And again, I have to mention that soon after 4 to 5 years of living in uncertainty and limbo, I and my family were quite lucky to be able to get permanent residency and again exercise our rights, and use the freedom of speech and sharing our stories as refugees with the general community. For me, it was quite important, to open up a civil conversation with the people that I was interacting in the community. I saw that there was lack of, understanding. There was lack of, recognizing the kind of circumstances that refugee communities were actually escaping from. And I think engaging with people in civil conversation really allowed, both of us, refugee community and the civil society, to actually start changing their mindset and attitude and perception around, refugees. It wasn't about refugees coming to Australia, for economic reasons. It was more about refugees trying to seek establish safety and security, which was the most important aspects for us in Australia. Very soon, I became, one of the ambassadors for Chill Out and start, advocating for the rights of children in detention centers. We all know that detaining a child in Australia, in any detention center, should be the last resort. But unfortunately, we've been witnessing the Australian history for the past, at least 20 to 21 years that I've been living in this country, that not necessarily this has been the case. Refugee children have been detained and the last resort hasn't been followed. And it has been a shame that, for us, we've taken those children away from the most, important stages of life. And one of that includes access to education. For myself and my other younger siblings back then, we could have used those years to study and definitely, we could have had a very much different future. But I think one thing that becomes quite important, I think, in refugee community is the strength and the resilience that they bring. And soon after, that we were given permanent residency and becoming an Australian citizen, I actually started my life as an advocate. I was only about 16 years old that I decided that I want to advocate and I want to share my story with people because they need to know what's happening to refugees. It was quite important to be able to share the story of refugees with lived or living experience to build understanding, to build, a much more cohesion and make it easier for people to actually ask each other questions and find out what exactly is happening. And it's not necessarily what gets portrayed in media. It's not necessarily about refugees being only war victims, and it's not necessarily about refugees, being economic burdens. There were other lens of refugee stories which had to be shared with the community. And I started my life as an advocate. For me, it was a privilege to be supported and mentored, by many strong Australians in terms of what advocacy meant and how I could start, sharing my own personal story as an advocate, and be strong and courage around, sharing those stories. But I think soon after I realized that sharing stories is important, but what happens to those stories became much more important to me. I remember that in the first few years when I was sharing my story and what happened to me in Afghanistan, what happened to me in the sea, spending 10 nights, and what happened to me in Australian detention center, all of this was so important because it was building a real evidence to what I went through. But for me, it was much more important as to what happened after I shared those stories. For the first few years for me, going to universities, going to platforms similar to this, sharing story was a priority. But then soon after, I realized the only thing that I was receiving from friends and institutions and other stakeholders was sympathy. It was a sympathy that I was receiving from people, but that's not the reason that I was sharing my story. For me, it was more to that. And soon after, I started to do, to change my own pathway, and I was able to work, and establish my own association in Australia, working with refugee women and girls called Hazara Women of Australia. For me, it was very important not only to, work and have interactions and civil conversation with the Australian community, but at the same time encourage my own community, to come and share and build much more friendship with the community, and also try to use their leadership and their strength and resilience in contributing back to the Australian community. And since I established my own association in Australia, I was only advocating at local level and national level in Australia. But soon after, I realized that, not only my own community from Afghanistan, but many other refugee communities from many other countries were actually experiencing the same thing, not only in Australia, but region-wide in the Asia Pacific, as well as, internationally. I started to see that the Rohingya refugees going through the same thing. The Syrian refugees are actually experiencing the same thing. I started to see that, in many parts of the world, the war and persecution has made many refugees homeless, has made many refugees to get onto the boat, has made many refugees to be locked up in detention centers, and that really made me to think beyond advocating at local and national level. And very soon, I was invited by UNHCR to go and discuss, the importance of refugee leadership and refugee inclusion at very important platforms like Geneva. For many, many times, I've been presenting at Geneva level, talking about how important it is for refugee leadership and refugee participation directly at those, policy discussions. When I started advocating at regional and international level, I started to see that there were a lot of places where they were talking about refugees and not necessarily including refugees. And hence, most of the time, the kind of response that we were actually putting into supporting refugees were not necessarily working, because all of those decisions were being made without refugees. And it didn't take me very long that back in the year of 2016, I start, advocating about, saying that nothing about us without us. And we did the same thing in Australia with the support of Refugee Council of Australia, where we started to say that, if we are to support refugees, it has to be with refugees. It has to be by refugees. And very soon after, once, places opened up, spaces opened up for refugees, not only to share stories, but to be actually, to actually start working with institutions, to work with donors, to work with education institutions, they tend to see a different result. Because again, I always say, especially now, if we are to look at this, the COVID situation, for example, is one of the real testimony that really indicated that the first and the last responders to any crisis is refugees themselves. So during the COVID pandemic, we really did see that a lot of international stakeholders and a lot of international actors were actually forced to work from home. Many were withdrawn from field work, and many refugees in many parts of the world were put again on their own, and they had to handle the situation themselves. And we saw during the COVID pandemic, the great capacity which refugees showed in solving issues around the COVID-19 pandemic. And very similarly for us in the Asia Pacific region, through the organization that again I established and co-founded at Asia Pacific regional level, which is a refugee-led network. And the only refugee-led network in the Asia Pacific region, named APNOR, the Asia Pacific Network of Refugees, we were actually able to bring, refugee communities across 9 countries in the Asia region and work together to support, the refugee community during the pandemic. And we were able to actually start a campaign called Refugees Rise campaign, where we were able to get resettled refugee health nurses, to support those back in the home countries like Iran, like Pakistan, like Indonesia and Malaysia, and few other countries by providing bilingual support. Or for example, in Iran, we were able to provide 150 food packages to undocumented refugee women. Or in Indonesia, we were able to connect those children that were actually forced to go home and leave the refugee learning centers and pair them up with refugee resettled in Australia and support them with online education. These are some of the examples where refugees were able to take on this to handle the situation themselves and really respond to the situations while many others couldn't. We've had this big UN agency trying to discuss and say, how do we actually respond in such situation? But refugees were actually doing it themselves.
That's been a really useful discovery. We've just got to move on to the next speaker. I really like your point about getting refugees involved during conversations about refugees. And I think that voice is incredibly important. Sandy also noted the importance of the voice of the youth. And up next, we have one such youth voice. So Sophie, our next speaker, is a Year 9 student and has played an active role in a school representative council for the past 7 years. She has an interest in social justice, particularly in issues affecting asylum seekers and refugees. In 2020, Sophie spent a year researching and producing a podcast, as I've said before, to raise awareness of the Tamil family, including Priya, Nades, Kopika and Tharunicaa. Now, this was broadcasted on a local radio station and is available on Spotify for us. We'll send the links through later. But Sophie, welcome. We're running short of time, but we're really keen to hear from you. What motivates a young person such as yourself to be interested in the refugee crisis? What makes you spend a year making such a podcast?
Well, my interest was initially sparked when my family and I travelled around Australia and we met a couple who were refugee advocates, and we learned a lot through them about the plight of refugees and asylum seekers in Australia. And then in primary school in grade 5, I was elected onto the Student Representative Council, and I was chosen to be the Social Justice Minister, which was quite a title for a 9-year-old. And I organised awareness raising and fundraising within my school. And my first initiative was a cake stand, and all the funds from that went towards phone cards for refugees and asylum seekers on Manus Island. And found a region for refugees and to representative to talk to the students. And I also wrote and directed my school play and the program that I created to go with that. I sold that, and the money for that went to swimming lessons for refugee children. Last year, I was asked to spend a year creating a major work of my choice, and I immediately wanted to raise awareness for the plight of asylum seekers and refugees. And the more I read about Priya, Nades, Kopika and Tharunicaa, the more I wanted to discover and share their story, which is a brief introduction to their story. Is Priya, Nades are Tamil Sri Lankans who arrived in Australia separately by boat in 2012 and 2013. And they met and married in detention and then moved to Biloela, where their 2 daughters were born. Then in March 2018, the government failed to renew their visas and they were taken from Bilo to be deported to Sri Lanka. And mid-air, they were granted interim injunction over the phone by a judge, and this means the deportation was stopped. And then they were taken to Melbourne Transit Unit and later transferred to Christmas Island, where they've been just over 3 years. And I was particularly appalled by the treatment of this family. And for the first year of detention in Melbourne Transit Unit, they had no outside activities, leading to vitamin D deficiencies for both of the children. And Tharunicaa actually had to have her baby teeth removed. What I think concerns me the most is that we have many laws in Australia protecting children, and detention essentially undermines every aspect of these rights. And particularly the mental health of the parents, it can't be a good place to parent from, and there's no community to support them. And then I considered telling their story through a lot of different avenues, writing a book, making a documentary, but in the end, it evolved into a podcast.
Thank you, Sophie. That's just incredible to see you do that. At this point, I'm going to ask Sandy and Najeeba to both turn on their videos. So just to bring all of you back into the conversation, Najeeba, I'll let you lead this one. Do you have any questions for either Sandy and Sophie? Because it was incredible to see 3 different perspectives. So one from a very academic, research-based perspective, one from lived experiences now in the advocacy sector, and one from the perspective of a young activist. So Najeeba, would you like to take it forward from here for a bit? I think she's just coming on now. While we're waiting for Najeeba, I do have a question for you, Sophie. So what is your understanding of how the people you interviewed were able to affect change? And is there anything that you think is an important way forward?
Yeah, I think this question can be answered in 2 parts. Who I interviewed and why, and how they're able to affect change. And like you said, how we as everyday Australians are able to affect change. So I selected a range of interviewees because they all brought something different to the story. Margot McNeil was originally the family's counsellor and later became their friend, and Kopika and Tharunicaa even refer to her as Grandma Margot. And she outlines both the traumatizing events and paints a picture to the listener of the family. And Angela Fredericks is from Biloela and close with the family, and she's visited them twice on Christmas Island. And she knows Priya, Nades, Kopika and Tharunicaa and how detention is affecting them. And she's leading the Home to Billow campaign, which involves a Facebook page, attending marches, organising marches and rallies, and a lot of media interviews, which is really important. Dr. Matt Withers is a research fellow at Macquarie University and previously did his PhD in the University of Sydney, which involved a period of 1.5 years in Sri Lanka. And in the podcast, he talks about what potential danger Priya, Nades, Kopika and Tharunicaa will face if they return to Sri Lanka, and the civil war and the aftermath of that. And he speaks to the general public, which is really important, educating them, because it puts pressure on our governments to make policy changes. And Simone Cameron was a migrant English teacher in Biloela, and Nades was a part of that English program, and she visited them in Melbourne when she later moved there, and she did a lot of advocating. And Tamara Smith is a Greens MP member representing Ballina and the Northern Rivers, and the Greens Party has a compassionate policy for refugees and asylum seekers, and this includes a 7-day limit in onshore detention and eradicating offshore detention. And as an elected Greens MP, Tamara Smith is in a position to influence legislation change, and that's one of the many reasons that we do need more Greens in power. And Sarah Mayers of the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, Asylum Seeker and Refugee Mental Health Network, spoke in the podcast about how detention specifically affects children. And RENZCP provide a forum for the exchange of ideas in relation to mental health of asylum seekers and refugees, and advocate for the provision of high quality, like culturally sensitive mental health services for refugees and asylum seekers. So there are many ways that we as everyday Australians can affect change, and these include making as much noise as possible, as Sandy stated before. We need to write to our MPs and let them know that we're not happy and it's not what we as Australians stand for. The other thing is the family are also very isolated, so sending them letters and writing to them, just letting them know that they're not forgotten. And keep sharing their story with your friends, with your family, share what's going on, spread the truth. I also think it's a really nice thing just to keep spreading positive energy and believing that they'll return to Biloela.
Thank you. That was a wonderful summary. Sandy, would you like to add anything? We don't have any questions, any further questions, and we have a couple of minutes before we wrap up. So Najeeba and Sandy, if you have any concluding remarks, go ahead, take the floor.
I think what's really struck me is just the importance of having so many different players being involved. We've got Najeeba with the lived experience, and so we mustn't forget the voices of those people who have been detained, those who are actually in detention. But it's also important, as Sophie's demonstrated, to have that voice of the youth, and I think that is so powerful, and that emerged in my research as well. And just having that combination of, she was talking about the doctors and the lawyers, and that really aligns with the work that I've done. And so I think I think Australia needs to come together, and we really need to push forward to try and and push forward some legislative reform on this issue. And I believe that we can do it.
I agree, and I think it's best to push forward on a positive note. We've just had a question come through about the podcast. Both the podcast and a copy of Sandy's research will be made available. It'll either be emailed through and available through our social media, so keep an eye out on our social media. Najeeba, did you have any concluding remarks before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, my final comment is again around, ensuring that if we are working with refugees, whether they're refugee children, youth, or refugee women and girls, or refugee community in general, I think it's quite important to make their engagement and participation meaningful. And what I mean by that is that, we should be able to do it in four quick ways, and I'll say it very quickly. One is that we should be able to facilitate an ongoing sustained access. And that means it should not be only about putting them into consultations or ad hoc consultations. Second, facilitating refugee preparedness, whether it's about mentoring, training. The third is initiate institutional self-reflection, which is more about, looking at ways of dismantling power dynamic that exists between institutions and refugee community. And lastly is to finance refugee participation and refugee-led initiatives. Again, to be able to resource and invest in them. I think this is quite important if we are to engage them meaningfully. And thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Najeeba. We've definitely got a lot to take away today. There's definitely a lot of work done, but I think we're starting on a positive note. Today, we've heard from 3 experts and advocates who brought you specific expertise, knowledge, and motivations for advocacy on the issues of ending child immigration detention. Please visit our social media pages and our website for more information on how you can get involved. And together, we hope to create law that stops child detention in Australia once and for all. Thank you. Have a lovely night. End.
Thank you.